Hey, hi, good morning, good afternoon, good evening, wherever you are in the world. Today, I'm going to talk to you about the spotlight effect and the consequences on it and its relationship to trauma and PTSD. Now, the spotlight effect is a psychological phenomena where individuals tend to believe that others are paying more attention to them, or they're talking about them than they actually are. And it leads people to overestimate the extent in which others notice them or observe them or judge their appearance, their behaviors, or even your performance in social situations. In other words, individuals feel like they're constantly in the spotlight and assuming that others are scrutinizing their every move and their every behavior. Now, what are the consequences of the spotlight effect on our feelings and our emotions? Well, the first effect is we get social anxiety, and it contributes to individuals feeling overly self-conscious, and it evokes a very negative fear-based evaluation. And generally what happens, or why that happens, is our prefrontal cortex, which is just behind our forehead, will ignite. It's our eyes, it's our ears, it's our mouth, it's the smells, it's everything. It observes what's around us, and then we start to feel very uncomfortable when we see perhaps a group of people. And often this can happen before we even get to an event, so we become very conscious of what will happen if I get there. Our self-consciousness becomes a spotlight issue, and we may become excessively self-conscious. It leads to self-doubt, and it leads to a lack of self-confidence. And we may even worry about things like what we look like, what situations we placed in, when actually people may not even be noticing that we're there, but we are overly sensitive. I know through the work I do with the people on our program that the very first thing that they want to improve is their self-confidence, their self-esteem, their self-doubt. We know that trauma and having PTSD reduces all of those natural things that we should be working on. We also develop a very negative self-image about ourselves, and it leads to a negative self-perception. So where we might feel that where our ambiguous behaviors, that others are going to judge us on it, that they're going to pick up on these behaviors that perhaps only we know about, where most people won't really pick up what's going on for you. That's exactly what we do. So we erode our self-confidence, we erode our self-worth. It also starts to impact or impair our performance, and that could be work related. So we start to believe that we're not doing a very good job. We start to believe that our performance has been negatively impacted, and we start to experience really low performance. And often that's made up. I'm working with a client currently who has come to me because his perception of his job and what he's doing and how he's feeling about it and how his boss views it is so different that his boss has said, look, I don't understand what's going on for you. We have not perceived your performance as low. But he feels he's always under the spotlight. He feels that there's always something that's going to go wrong. So it decreases your performance in various tasks or activities. It could also be very situational. We also tend to start to avoid any behaviors. So the fear of being noticed or being judged can result in us avoiding certain situations so that we don't feel exposed or we don't start to feel vulnerable. We also become very emotionally distressed ourselves. So if we're constantly feeling like we've been observed or judged, it leads to our own emotional distress, which makes your anxiety worse, which then leads to a sense of isolation. So we move away from situations where this can happen. And that means that you go to less social situations. That shouldn't be happening, but we know it's a consequence of our trauma and our PTSD. Now, this psychological phenomena and the connection between the spotlight effect and trauma lies in how us as individuals, how we have experienced our trauma and how we've perceived it, and then we've interpreted these social situations. So trauma, people who've lived with trauma and then have this significant impact on how we view ourselves and how we view others. It has a massive impact on how we view our world. So it almost amplifies the emotions and the consequences of the trauma for you. And you know, they are very, very interconnected. So first of all, we feel like we have a heightened self-conscious. So trauma survivors often experience heightened feelings like shame and guilt or embarrassment. And then because of all the stuff that's happened in our past, it's amplified, it's made so much worse. They have very negative self-image. So it impacts their self-esteem and their self-worth. So when you've experienced past trauma and you have ongoing PTSD, you may feel flawed or damaged or inadequate. And this often comes out in personal relationships, in the home and at work. So we scrutinize our flaws and our shortcomings even more so. And then we feel like we've been judged everywhere. So trauma survivors fear that they are judged in all situations. And, you know, we can experience stigmatism or, and remember, trauma is vastly misunderstood. There isn't many people that will speak to someone and go, that person's been traumatized. They may pick it up if they know what's happened to you, but most people don't. Okay. So this potentially then leads to avoiding all types of social situations. It also leads to social isolation, where we have this sense of withdrawal from anything social, and it further isolates an individual because they don't believe they should be there, or they believe that they're going to be spoken about. So there's a huge disconnect between the individual and social situations, and it will then start to embed in family as well. So we also have impaired coping mechanisms. So where we would naturally be able to develop a coping strategy for something that's happened when you've had past trauma or you've got PTSD, it makes it very difficult for the person to effectively manage a little bit of social anxiety, or being or made to feel awkward in a social situation. And the spotlight effect heightens the stress, and it diminishes the ability to cope, leading to increased emotional distress. And then I see this very often is hypervigilance. A lot of people will become very, very hypervigilant. They will, it'll become a defense mechanism. You'll start to scan your external environment. Your amygdala has little radars on the top of your head. It starts to assess and look around you and become super hypervigilant. And this has massive impact on whether you've been observed or judged. And then this then impacts where you are. So how do we fix these issues? Well, you need to work on your self-confidence and your self-esteem, and you have to work on the triggers of your PTSD or your trauma. And if you don't do this, it leads to negative thoughts. So a quick technique to use is identify your negative thoughts. Where are they coming from? Write them down, make a note of them. When do they occur? Is it the time of day? Is it when you're in contact with someone? Is it in a location? And then question the evidence. You know, where's the evidence come from? Where have I seen this before? What's happened to me in the past? Have I lived through this? And then you have to consider an alternative explanation as to why you're feeling this way. Consider why people, what have people got to speak to you about? Like, what have they got on you to have this conversation? Okay. So there are a lot of things that you can do, but I know how hard it is if you try and do this by yourself. You can practice mindfulness to quieten the brain, but I know a lot of people find this quite difficult. We have a very thorough process in which, or which we use called the trauma recovery method, to help you to overcome this process. The spotlight effect is just one small thing that happens to people who've had trauma and PTSD. I hope that today you could relate to this in some sort of way. But there is a way through it. And I know that working through this on your own is hard. perhaps you really relate to this today. If you want to find out more or you need a conversation, please do watch our webinar. We will post the webinar underneath my live this week. Or if you're listening to this as a podcast, please find the Trauma Recovery School Limited. We've got a Facebook page. We've also got our page on the web. Listen to our webinar, book a call to speak with us. We would love to help you. I hope you've enjoyed this live today or this podcast. And if you have any questions, please chat. Have a fantastic day. Bye.